I'm gonna share some real stories today. Details changed, obviously, but real situations from properties we've taken over or landlords who came to us after something had already gone sideways. I want to be clear about why I'm sharing these. It's not to scare anyone, and it's not to make anyone feel bad about what happened. Every single one of these landlords was doing their best with the information they had. That's the whole point. They weren't reckless. They just had a gap in information, in process or in awareness, and that gap got expensive. If someone watching this recognizes something and avoids a situation they didn't have to be in, that's the goal. I'm Candace Blair. Let's get into it. First type of thing we see regularly, I call it the inherited problem. A landlord comes to us and the property has issues that have built up over time without anyone realizing it. A situation that's pretty representative, we took over a property where the owner had been self-managing for years. Good landlord, stable tenant, generally smooth. But over time, a few things had accumulated. The lease hadn't been updated in years and was missing addendums that had since become required in California. The rent was significantly under market, and there was water intrusion, an issue that the tenant had mentioned a couple of times but never escalated, and the owner hadn't been able to fully access it remotely. When we did our initial review, all three of those were visible right away. None of them were catastrophic at that point, but all three needed attention, and the water situation especially needed to get in front of someone before it became a habitability concern. We took over a property where the lease hadn't been updated in 4 years. Here is what we found. The lease was the first thing we reviewed. It was missing 3 required California addendums that became mandatory after the lease was originally signed. Not because the landlord ignored them, they just simply didn't know they existed. The risk wasn't immediate. The tenancy was completely fine, but if a dispute had come up about anything, that lease would not have held up in the way the landlord assumed it would have. It was offering legal protection they thought they had, but they didn't. We got everything updated within the first 60 days, new lease, compliant addendums, all properly documented. The landlord said they had no idea, which is the most common thing we hear. Not, I knew and I didn't bother, just I didn't know. Another pattern, deferred maintenance. Not neglect, just gradual accumulation of small things that never quite cross the threshold of feeling urgent. Situation I'm thinking of, aging HVAC system. The landlord knew it was getting older. He had been told at the last service appointment that it might need to be replaced in the next couple of years. That was 3 years ago. The unit was still running, so it stayed on the we'll deal with it eventually list. When it failed in July in Orange County. The landlord had to move fast to get a replacement in, and because it was urgent and peak season, the cost was significantly higher than a planned replacement would have been. Total out-of-pocket was about double what proactive replacement would have cost. And the tenant was days without AC, and that created a strain that took a while to smooth over. A landlord waited too long on one maintenance item. Here's what it ended up costing. Deferred maintenance is one of the most common and most avoidable cost drivers in rental ownership. The logic feels right in the moment. The thing is still working. Replacement costs money, so you wait. But what you're usually doing is trading a known cost for an unknown one. And emergency repairs are always going to be more expensive than planned ones. HVAC, water heaters, roofing, all three give you signals before they fail. All three are significantly cheaper to deal with proactively, and all three, if they fail at the wrong time, can create not just a repair bill, but a habitability situation with legal implications in California. So if you've got a system that's aging, knowing its condition and having a plan for it is worth the service call. Tenant screening is probably the single highest leverage decision a landlord makes. Because once someone is in the property, California's tenant protection means that if that tenant goes bad, the exit process is slow, legal, and expensive. The front door really is your best filter. We've seen situations where landlords made screening decisions based on gut feeling rather than documented criteria. And because they couldn't point to a consistent written standard applied to all applicants, they found themselves in a difficult position when a tenant later claimed that the decision was discriminatory, even when it wasn't, and even when the decision was purely practical. The lack of documentation made it much harder to demonstrate that. California's fair housing requirements requirements apply regardless of how many units you own. Having a written screening criteria you apply consistently isn't just good practice, it's protection. Tenant screening decision became a fair housing complaint. Here's what to know. Fair housing law applies to every California landlord, no matter how many units you have. The important thing to understand, most fair housing issues don't come from intentional discrimination. They come from inconsistency. So applying different standards to different applicants, making exceptions for people you don't make for others, using criteria that aren't written down. The fix is simple, but requires intention. So write down your screening criteria. Income requirements, credit thresholds, rental history standards. Apply them the same way to every applicant and document your decisions. That documentation protects you, not because it makes you immune from complaints, but because it gives you a clear, consistent basis for every decision you made. And that's what matters if something gets challenged. A landlord came to us 6 months into a hard tenancy. Here's what we wish they would have known earlier. By the time a landlord reaches out 6 months into a difficult tenancy, the options are usually narrower than they would have been at the start. In California, once a tenant is in possession, addressing a non-performing tenancy is a structured process that takes time. If notices aren't served correctly, if documentation isn't complete, if the process isn't followed exactly, it extends. Landlords who come to us in mid-situation are often surprised there aren't more shortcuts. The answer is almost always, we can work through this, but it's going to take the time it takes. The lesson isn't that tenants are adversaries. Most tenants are genuinely fine. It's just that getting the front end right, screening, lease documentation, makes everything after easier. There's no workaround on the back end that makes up for the rush on the front end. Looking across all these stories, and I could share a dozen more, the common thread is it's never bad intentions. Nobody in any of these situations was trying to cut corners or ignore the rules. The common thread is a gap. The lease that wasn't current, a maintenance item deferred too long, screening process that wasn't documented, a situation that escalated before the landlord knew how to respond. All of those gaps are closable. None of them require a law degree. They just require knowing they exist and having a process that addresses them. Every landlord mistake I've ever seen has one thing in common. It's not what you'd expect. It's not carelessness. It's not bad intentions. It's incomplete information at a moment when a decision has to be made. The landlord with the outdated lease, he didn't know it was outdated. The one who deferred the HVAC, she didn't know about the habitability implications. The one whose screening wasn't documented didn't know that consistency was the core of fair housing compliance. In every case, if someone had just told them what they needed to know and why it mattered, the outcome would have been different. That's honestly why I make this content, not to position myself as the only answer, just to close some of those gaps. Because most of the time, the right information at the right moment is all it takes. If any of these felt familiar, if you recognized a situation or a gap in your own setup, I'd encourage you to take a look at it now rather than later. Small gaps are easier to close before they become something bigger. If you want a second set of eyes on something, a lease question, a tenant situation, a compliance question, I'm happy to be a resource. That's what I'm here for. Candace Blair, and I'll see you on the next one.